Hey everyone, this is Mark Adamski with the Wilderness Reboot podcast, a transitional support community for Wilderness Alum, and we have an amazing guest today. We're really excited to chat with John Tobias from Cedar Transitions. What's up, man?
Hey, Mark. Thanks for having me.
Likewise. I'm really we talked a little bit earlier. I'm happy you had some time to chat, and man, you have a really cool background. I think a lot of our listeners are going to want to know a lot more about your story, and just how you got into wilderness and kind of how that's evolved to what you're doing now. So we'd love to just kind of just chat, have a conversation, and kind of get to know you.
Sure. Happy to chat.
So tell us, where your journey began, how you got maybe into mental health and therapy, if you'd like to share that part. And then, starting maybe with the wilderness space, we can kind of start there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I started my entry into wilderness therapy was kind of a backdoor entry in that when I started in September of 1998 at Aspen Achievement Academy in Central Utah, uh, one of the grandfathers of the whole wilderness therapy industry. But I started with actually very little interest in the whole therapeutic end of things.
Mm.
I was coming out of a kind of a pure wilderness guiding background. I was working for a company in Boulder, Utah, which is a tiny little town on the side of Boulder Mountain in Utah, called Boulder Outdoor Survival School, or BOSS.
Oh, cool.
And I was leading a trip over the summer of 98, and I was talking to one of my coworkers, and I asked him, I said, well, what do you do? Because Boss at that point was very seasonal. Like, we would do trips from spring to mid fall and then have the winters off. And I asked him, well, what do you do in the winter? Like, how do you make money, or do you make money? And he said,
Right.
there's this place, there's this program up out of Loa, Utah, which was, I don't know, 50, maybe 40 miles north of Boulder or something like that. And there's this company there called Aspen Achievement Academy, and they do wilderness therapy trips. And that's the first time I'd ever heard of wilderness therapy. I of course knew what wilderness was. I knew kind of roughly what therapy was, but no idea of this like whole wilderness therapy business. And he explained to me what it was, and I said, that sounds pretty cool. So we finished that particular trip, and he and I went up from Boulder to Loa, Utah, and he introduced me to Rich Adams, who was the field director at Aspen at the time. And this is probably early August of 98. And he said, well, we've got a staff training coming up in September or maybe late August, and you're invited. So I did my last course at Boss, went up to Aspen, did the staff training, and then was invited to be a staff, and then started
Nice.
in September of 98. And so, my the initial motivation was just really something that I could do through the whole year, through the winter, where I would be paid to have a backpack on my back.
Right.
Um, and it like, but and that was great. It certainly met that motivation. But also, kind of as I was doing that, the whole therapeutic side of things started to really um, pick up steam for me, as far as gathering my interest, or
Hmm.
becoming an interest of mine. So
Hmm.
over the years, I just found myself more and more thinking about like what's happening with these clients psychologically. Um, and then the other piece is, I was a field staff for like 10 years, on and off, but spent
Really?
a lot of time
That's
field
a
work.
lot of time. That's not
It's a lot of time.
typical. Yeah. Wow.
Um, and one
And
of the
real
reasons,
quick, you were
yeah,
working at that wilderness school before,
yeah.
right? So you had a lot of field days.
Yeah, I mean, if I count Boss, and then, the 10 years in the field, I mean, and then I worked at Outward Bound as well.
Oh, you did.
So I've got a lot of field days. And the 10 years in wilderness therapy as a guide wasn't like straight through 10 straight years.
Sure,
Like,
yeah, you gotta take some breaks.
yeah, I would, work 6 months, do something else for 6 months, come back for 9 months, do something else for 3 months. Like, I would piece it together. But nonetheless, as you know, like, even doing it that way, 10 years is a long time. Uh,
Yeah, yeah.
so, and it just became more and more interesting to me from a psychological perspective as to what
Mm,
was happening with these clients in the field, these students, we would
right.
call them. And then the added piece was it was pushing me in ways that was sometimes difficult or painful,
Mm,
but ultimately healthy. Like I could see myself growing through that process, and so like when we would have a visitor out to the group or introducing ourselves to new clients and staff, like I would always say, and it would roll around to me, and I would talk about how long I've been there and why. Like at least part of it was the growth that I was still getting out of being a field staff.
yeah,
And that's one of the probably the biggest reason that I stuck it out that long. Like it really pushed me in really healthy ways for a long time.
yeah. Yeah, especially like a lot of the lifestyle field staff, like so nomadic. And speaking of transitions, there's so many, like you said, even 10 years coming back and taking breaks and, just I think in that culture is really unique. Everyone, a lot of people get into that field. They say like that's their people, they found their people. And I think, yeah, you definitely mirror that growth with students and you just got to keep it real to show up for them, right? And that's really cool to hear, man. You're like I
Yeah,
was saying earlier before we press the record button how you're like the OG, one of the OG, original adventure therapists here, wilderness therapists, and you even have now this backstory that I didn't know the
yeah,
guiding. So it makes sense. It's cool to hear how that was your story coming into this.
yeah. That was my entrance into this world. Yeah.
Yeah, and so were there other programs? Did you stick with that program? Because I know they've things happen and there's different evolution of programs after them.
Yeah. So I was at Aspen Achievement Academy, like I said, on and off for 10 years or so. And then at various points in Aspen's uh, growth, um, other programs started out of Aspen. Um, Therapists and staff and people who went on to start Second Nature, and then all of the growth that came out of Second Nature and then Open Sky, of course. So I'm in a pretty unique and privileged position. I mean, there are a handful of us out there, but that I know all of those people who
Yeah,
started these programs, and some of them quite well. Um, so it's been cool to see, like a lot of the people that I was guiding with aren't in the industry anymore, but it's been cool to see, those of us who are, whether it's ed consultants or therapists or program owners,
right.
like the paths that we've taken, and we're still part of this in some way or another.
Well,
Uh, yeah,
yeah, I remember a little statistic that a field instructor shared with us when I was getting my undergrad in venture education. They shared past the age of 30, if you're still in the guiding field, you're like a 2%. It's like a 2% chance of staying in it. And
the
but yeah,
two
people
percenters.
obviously take different directions, but it's cool to see like you mentioned who's in it, what people are still doing, and that community. I feel like when you're out in the backcountry, you're gonna stay in touch with those people, or just pick up where you left off, wherever that was, because it was something pretty epic, right?
For sure, for sure. It's like I see a lot of these people at conferences, and it's just like we're sitting across a campfire out in the wilderness together once again. It's like, we pick right up where we left off, and there's such a richness of shared history for most of us, which was a pretty, which was at a pretty kind of uh, influential part of our lives, like,
Yeah,
being 20-year-olds or early 30-year-olds and trying to figure out like what's next, and yet still really enjoying being in the woods and having deep wilderness experiences. uh, like some of the and I'm sure it's going to be this way the rest of my life. Like some of the best friends that I have currently at, 51 years old were built, in 1998 or thereabouts in
Right.
the woods. Um, you mentioned it. It's like it that industry specifically, wilderness therapy, being a guide, like it attracts a certain person, a certain adventurous spirit, a certain person
Yeah.
who likes to have fun, a certain person who likes to push themselves physically and mentally. Um, and that can actually bleed into kind of unhealthy ways too,
Right. Right.
but definitely pretty vital and engaged in life kind of people.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I always ask folks who are still getting after, like, well, adventure's still in your blood. Like,
That's
it's
it.
just it's there. It's not, and yeah, it's definitely like such a transient, wild and fun, and really caring and yeah, there's a lot of words. I don't know. There's a lot of words, but it's cool to hear you describe that because I feel like that's where I am in my life. That emerging, emerging into this profession more, coming from field guiding and figuring that out. It's just to be real. It is cool. It is cool staying in touch with those people. And what I think is so cool about like, and I want to maybe chat next about just like communities like that's showing up for field staff and field guides and people in this work, and also alumni themselves. Because what also is interesting that I really try to sit with and contemplate is I may have been in the backcountry a lot and have some field days, but consecutively, maybe for a lot of these students leaving wilderness programs, around 12 weeks, 90 days with mental health. I mean, that's more intense. It's a little bit of a different experience. I mean, we're there, we're maybe there 2 week shifts at most, maybe a month. Some older programs now it's more of like an 8 day on, 6 day off. That's a little bit different too. And like if we're authentically showing up, being like, "Hey man, how are you? Like, what's up? What are you doing now?" And we're so excited to connect with our old staff and co-guides. Why wouldn't alumni as well? And that brings up the question like, what is so special about being in the backcountry with like no distractions and not having your phone and just showcasing your personality after, they say 72 hours is when your personality comes out. Like you can't hide it for that long in the backcountry. And so like, what is it that makes wilderness, in your opinion, John, like so special?
Well, at least part of it you just put to words. You said you can't hide it. That's at least part of it. Is like try as people might, and some people try real hard. Uh,
Yeah.
it's hard to stay hidden for all that long in that context, in that setting. You're stripped of, at least in many programs, most programs, and I'll even say the best programs, uh, although people might want to debate that. But you're stripped of many of the creature comforts that the cell phones, and you're not wearing you're wearing these different clothes that someone gave you, and they're not your clothes, and it's so, I wanted to say the word foreign, but in some ways, like it's not. It's like the opposite of foreign. It's home, I think. But
Right.
it's so different. I'll put it that way than than how most of us live our lives. Like we're not having multi-day wilderness experiences very
Yeah.
often, especially our clients. So it's so different that a lot of those kind of creature comforts are things that we can hide behind, that we can kind of put up as a shield, that we can lose ourselves in, that can come in between, like really connecting with those around you. Um, so I think that's a big part of it. Is like you can kind of fake your way through a day or two, but it's hard to fake your way through 10 or 12 weeks of a wilderness experience. Like you're gonna
Yeah.
start getting real. We're gonna start seeing what's underneath. So
Yeah.
I think that's a huge part of it. Um, when I was a wilderness therapist, and I'd be talking to parents about why their kid was doing so well in the wilderness, like better than they had in like more traditional settings. I would break down the change that we were seeing this way. I would say I think about 50% of it is a good, solid wilderness experience, which has various components. It has the kind of the technology cleanse. Um, it has exercise. You know, for most of our clients, they're in their bodies more than they have been in years,
Right.
which leads to good sleep. So most of them are sleeping better than they have in a long time.
Basic. Mm-hmm.
And not all of them, but many of them are actually eating better than they have in years. So I really do think like, and I love wilderness therapy. I think there's a part for the therapy, and I'll get around to that. But I think just that, like a good
Yeah.
solid wilderness experience, is about 50%, if I'm honest. Um, and
Yeah.
then uh, about 35%, maybe 40% would be the relationships that clients are making with peers and with staff. Like that's huge. Like those relationships in that setting are a huge part of the change that we see for various reasons that I could dive into. The last 10 to 15%, you know, I would say this as a wilderness therapist talking to parents is, you know, maybe that the 10 to 15% is the hot air that comes out of my mouth. And it sounds like self-deprecating, and it is, but I mean it. Like I because as a wilderness therapist, and I think you know it sounds like you want to get into being a wilderness therapist. Like it's I mean it can kind of feel like a rock star because most of the time clients are demonstrating change that no one has seen in their lives up to that point.
Yeah.
And so, and you as the therapist, you're often well, you are the go-between between what's happening in the field and the client
Right.
and mom and dad and or the ed consultant. So you're like this exalted figure, like, oh, like, you know, look what
Right.
Mark is doing with our son. And, you know, yeah, or John, like, yeah, I think I was doing good work, but the vast majority is a wilderness experience and
Right.
the relationships that are being made both with peers and staff in the wilderness. So I believe that to this day. Like
Yeah. Yeah.
you know, so
That's awesome. Yeah, it's like that experiential learning cycle. It makes me think of like in an outdoor adventure ed, outdoor education setting, field instructor, maybe with the outward bound, you're still, independent reflection versus a facilitator breaking that down. It's kind of like still debriefing, but now maybe like the therapist is a little bit more clinically focused and things like that. But like generally, yeah, they're having that crazy breakthrough on the trail. They're making connections. I think outdoor leadership in general is going to foster just like foundational communication, like not coming off, and you're getting that real life feedback with your group. If you're coming off a little passive aggressive, if you're too quiet, if you're not speaking up, and then also like the decisions you are making, what are they rooted in? And you find often that they're like, in my experience, they're like their core values, their core beliefs, and how they experience life themselves and how they want to be treated. And that's how their leadership style comes out. And it helps them, I think, in that sense that I've seen with outdoor leadership, get them really close, with an establishment or a semblance of like who they are. And yeah, I think, yeah. And they also, in some of the research, I'm sure you're probably more familiar with that. Like they also found that it's also that therapeutic relationship with like field staff and field guides that is really impactful. Cause yeah, maybe a lot of them didn't have community when they get to wilderness. And that's what's so cool about, I think, yeah, that community is, it's like, there's like a reverence. It's just, it's like what happens in the backcountry stays in the backcountry. And yeah, people get really vulnerable. You see a lot of tears, a lot of goofy, funny moments. Like I don't think I've ever laughed as hard as I had when I'm just in the backcountry on a crazy creek.
for
Just
sure, for sure.
and
Yeah,
people, you make shows, you come up with your own entertainment. Whether it's like, I remember one time just having fun with folks on with different rocks. We were creating like different characters,
yeah,
and this one guy had this kind of rock with another one that was flat that kind of looked like this kind of like, I don't know, conquest, like old school kind of like hat. I don't know how to describe it. It was like Don Francisco, and it was like this Spanish like it was like the funniest caricature. You remember all
yeah.
these
No,
goofy
no.
kind
I
of
mean,
moments like
you're right. It's like spending time in the backcountry like that and experiencing hardship with each other, like that community gets so tight. And in a good wilderness kind of peer culture, vulnerability is invited and it's cherished. And then on top of that, you have the context, i.e. the wilderness, which calls vulnerability out of us, right?
Yeah,
Like it's hard not to be when people are seeing us at our best and our worst and everywhere in between. So, and which all of that fosters a sense of community that I mean, and I don't use this word lightly, but it can be sacred. And that's
yeah,
why
love
you'll
that.
you'll have people who say, whatever happens moving forward, like you will always be my brothers and sisters, like, and it's real, like
No, it's
they
so
it's
real.
real for them. So yeah.
That's so awesome. Yeah, and I think in my experience, when you do get certain folks coming in the wilderness, perhaps there's some resistance, right? That's a part of who we are. There's always resistance in something.
Yeah.
And when you push through challenges and struggles, it comes out. You see it. I mean, I see it in my own life, right? We all have it. And so, like, what I've always found interesting was, when a new member maybe comes into the group, they don't have that buy in. It's never really any other authority figures like other program staff or guides, even sometimes who sometimes have really good reports, not even them. It's the young group members, like the ones who've been there week 10, week 11. We're about to have their exit group or their graduation ceremony, whatever that looks like for the program.
Yeah.
And they see what that looks like. And they're like seeing this kumbaya, this kind of sacred space of that group culture that's so close, and
Yeah.
how happy and sad they are for a member to go, and they want to be a part of that. And I think that's the pull, right? And a real meaningful connection. Like all these kids now are really connected, you could argue, with social media and technology, but I think, with that new generation, they don't know what it was like before that. And I
Yeah.
think we all want meaning, right?
Yeah, for
And that's what's
sure.
cool. Like you do the community model, and I want to ask more about that with Red Cedar Transitions with what you're doing now. And can you just tell folks a little bit about what you're doing now? And yeah,
Yeah. So I've got a program here in Asheville, North Carolina, beautiful Asheville. Um, we are a young adult transition program, and when I say transition, typically, well, it means typically one of two things. It's either transitioning to us out of a wilderness therapy program, or transitioning to us out of more traditional residential aftercare programs. Um, and I would say the split right now is about 50-50. 50% of our clients are coming directly out of wilderness, and 50% are coming out of more traditional residential aftercare setting. Now, when I say traditional, what I mean mainly is a residential setting versus our model, which is what I call a community-based model. So,
gotcha.
in other words, like we're not a brick and mortar program. We don't have a house for all of our clients to come live in together. Instead, they're moving to Asheville. We're helping them get set up in various independent living situations, whether it's apartments or houses or whatever it might be. Um, I will say this, that I started this because as a wilderness therapist and getting to know a lot of ed consultants and just kind of keeping track of what was being offered to my clients leaving wilderness, because I was a pretty active part in that whole process, so that kind of
Yeah,
aftercare process. Um, there are some really good, more traditional um, programs out there. Again, when I say traditional, I mean residential. Um, and I would say for about 80% of my clients leaving wilderness, they needed that, and they still do coming out of wilderness.
yeah,
They need the more traditional, you live in one house or two houses. You have very much kind of this built-in peer culture. Hopefully, it's a positive peer culture, but you've got this built-in peer culture. And then a lot of those programs, they have kind of a phase-out system where they gain more and more independence. Maybe they live off campus at some point.
right. Okay,
That's what I mean by more traditional versus ours. Day one, they're living independently or very close to independently, like with a roommate. Um, so, like I was saying, about 80% of my clients leaving the woods needed the more traditional. I started Red Cedar for like that 10 to 20% where I didn't necessarily think they needed that because, often what comes with the more traditional setting is like a minimum length of stay, whether it's 6 months or 9
Right.
or a year.
Interesting.
There's like a phase system and levels, and it can be kind of behavior modification. And there's nothing wrong with it. Like I said, I think that's needed for about 80% of clients coming out of the woods. But there was about 10 to 20% where I felt like they didn't necessarily need that. And at least with some of those programs, there was a programmatic inflexibility, meaning like this phase looks exactly like this. There's no wiggle room. The next phase looks exactly. And again, I think that's great. It's needed for a lot of clients, but I wanted to start something that was more flexible. Um, and I started it for that 10 to 20% where I didn't think they needed the more traditional setting, but I
Mm.
also wasn't ready to say, yeah, you're ready to go back home.
There is a space. Yeah, it totally makes sense. And I,
So so I started Red Cedar for that, that 10 to 20%.
yeah,
It's a narrow niche. And I'm, as you can tell, even currently, I'm very clear. Like
yeah,
we're not for most coming out of wilderness. They actually do need the more behavior mod
mhm,
residential experience. But so what we're finding is, we are filling that niche for like the 10 to 20% that might be a good fit for us coming out of wilderness. But then, we're also getting a lot of those clients who have done the more traditional aftercare setting, and the treatment team collectively, and hopefully the client as well, believes like, what, I made it through 9 months or a year of this more traditional setting, and I'm not quite ready to step off into the rest of my life. That's where Red Cedar can fill that gap. And the way that I talk about us too is, if a client is a good fit for us and if the trajectory goes as hoped, we are the last step into the rest of their young adult
right,
life. Not that they won't need, maybe some therapeutic support in the community at some point, but we hope to be the last program, before they can step into the rest of their lives.
right. Like the final wraparound, and
Yeah.
yeah, and it's cool because yeah, everyone's coming from a different place, and so that plays a role in the aftercare options. And some transitional programs are becoming more short term, and yeah, and then also like it's not all families, but many families are also financially exhausted after wilderness placements, or
There's that too.
and yeah, and so it's good to see resources like this and options like what you're doing. And for folks coming from maybe traditional programs, like you said, maybe they didn't have much of like a wilderness or adventure program experience. And it sounds like maybe do you do some of that in Asheville too, like
We do
meetups, or do
some.
you get yeah?
We do some. We don't. It's not our bread and butter.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we do some hikes. Like we have in the past, like customized some wilderness
Oh,
experiences, and
cool.
and I think we would at least entertain the idea of doing it in the future. But I think more often than not, I mean, there are people who do specifically that,
Cool.
and we at this point we're referring clients who are looking for something like that to someone else, and maybe they go do a week with someone else and then come back to us.
Gotcha.
Um, so
So,
everyone on staff at this point has, even our therapists have a wilderness therapy background except for one person.
oh yeah, no kidding.
So, we're all kind of outdoorsy people. So I feel comfortable doing that, like creating an experience,
Right.
but it's just not, it's not our bread and butter. So
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
yeah.
Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about like your approach? I read some stuff on the website, but I want you speak to it. But I saw the acceptance commitment therapy, the ACT. Does that sound correct?
Yeah.
And you do coaching and psychotherapy. I think that'd be cool for folks to hear about, your approach and how you know, exactly what would a week look like, or, I'm sure it's individualized, but I'm going to kind of let you explain that.
Sure, sure. We are, yes, we are very individualized. And again, that was in answer to the inflexibility that I was seeing in some of our industry programmatically. So we're very individualized, even like week to week programmatically, meaning, well, with new clients, we tend to land at 10 to 15 hours a week of coaching support and then 2 hours a week of psychotherapy. And at some point, the hope is that we can start scaling back some of that programming, both the coaching and the therapy. So maybe, whether it's the end of month one or month two or month three, maybe we drop down from 15 hours to 12 hours. Maybe the next month we drop down to 10 hours. And then with the therapy as well, like at some point, let's go to an hour a week. And then, I have clients that I see once a month, and that's a good sign. It means they want to
Yeah.
stay connected to Red Cedar, and yet, they're doing well. That they don't need a lot of programming. So that flexibility piece is really what we're after with this model: is being able to meet each client and their needs exactly where they're at, even from week to week. So occasionally, let's say we've scaled down to 8 hours a week of coaching, and they hit a bump in the road, whether
Mm,
there's a breakup or they lose their, whatever it might be, relapse, and
right.
we need to scale back up. Then we scale back up. Um,
Yeah.
so it's really, even on a week to week basis, it's quite flexible. But we do tend to land with new clients at 10 to 15 hours a week of coaching and 2 hours of psychotherapy.
Wow.
Um, and the coaching, I mean, so you can tell it's a coaching heavy model. Uh, you know, just for kind of ease of math, if we, let's say we're at 12 hours a week with a client, what we found is that more frequent coaching sessions, but maybe of shorter duration, uh, makes more sense, is more effective than um, longer coaching sessions, but not as frequent. So what I mean by that is like, well, that 12 hours would be broken down into maybe 6 days a week at 2 hours a day versus 2 days a week at 6 hours a day.
Yeah, totally.
That kind of day to day touch point with us can
Yeah.
create some momentum, because, part of the coaching, there is some accountability. We ask, like, we've put together this planner. We ask, like, hey, yesterday we came up with 5 or 6 things that, we wanted to accomplish. When I say we, most of the time with new clients, the coach is actually doing some of these things with the client.
It's very
Um,
collaborative. Yeah, it sounds like.
yeah. And then, so, let's get out the planner again today. What worked for you yesterday? What didn't? It's a very kind of non judgmental problem solving approach to kind of the logistics of putting together a values driven life. And, that values driven piece is very much an ACT thing, an acceptance and commitment therapy perspective of, helping clients get clear on what's important to them, connecting with those values, and then starting to set concrete, smart goals, good old fashioned smart goals in
Yeah,
service
good old
of these
fashioned.
values. So the coaching, so it's a coaching heavy model, and the coaching has two components. One is, I was just kind of talking about, it's the very strategic time management, goal clarification, values clarification, and connection. Um, very kind of nuts and bolts, logistics heavy. Uh, could be things like time management, money management.
Mm,
It kind of can take many different forms. But then the other piece, the other component to the coaching is the doing with, like I mentioned. It's like, okay, so we've come up with 5 or 6 things today that are important for you to work on or move toward. The language that we use is, we call them toward moves, and what that means is moving toward the life that you want to build. So
yeah.
we come up with 5 or 6 toward moves for you today. Out of these 5 or 6, what are 2 or 3 that you and I can do together? And so the coach, that might look like, okay, get out your laptop, we're going to work on a budget. It might look like, okay, one of the things that you said you wanted to do was get to a yoga class, get your yoga mat. I'm going to take you to the yoga class and do it with you. Or it might be, I'm going to help you fill out these job applications and sit here with you. Or the coaching, I talk about the coaching this way. I want the coaching to be in the context that matters, which is
Yeah.
out in the real world. Not
Right.
very rarely is the coaching happening like although we do have offices. in our offices. Like I want it to be
Right.
engaged in the world. So yeah, the coaches' jobs are they're pretty unique. Like, they're doing a lot of a lot of like healthy life building with clients.
Yeah.
Um,
Modeling and
yeah,
yeah, being collaborative and
being collaborative. Yeah.
yeah, it kind of
So
feels like that field guide kind of relationship.
very much
Sounds
so.
like.
Very
Yeah.
much so. Yeah, it's certainly rubbed off on in kind of the spirit of Red Cedar.
That's sweet.
Um, just to jump on a word that you just said, it's worth building on. Like you used the word collaborative. That is very much the spirit of Red Cedar. We really try to create this non-hierarchical, we're the expert, and just
Yeah.
finger wagging. You need to live your life, this way or that way. It's no, like ultimately, I want you to be the expert in your life, and
Yeah.
we can kind of help you explore that, but too often by the time clients get to us, they've been through programs as adolescents.
Right.
They may have been through 2 or 3 programs as young adults. And they're just kind of used to this, like, okay, another program.
Some
And
program
I
fatigue.
guess I'll check the box. And
Yeah.
like the very kind of hierarchical, non collaborative, um, approach to the world. And so we're inviting them back into a sense of agency and responsibility in,
Sure.
in collaboration. Um, so that's a lot of our focus is how can we really invite in a strong way clients out of this kind of stuck, almost like identified patient place from the family systems perspective, where they're just kind of they're the problem and they just need to be fixed. It's
Cool.
like come back, come back into, and maybe not even back, but come into this new place of young adulthood, which is, being an agent in your own life and you deciding what's important to you, not anyone else. Um, so that's it. That's really important to us. Is just as much as we can fostering that spirit.
That's huge. Yeah, I love a lot of what you said. You mentioned like even before that, like momentum and in context of kind of building that agency and not having that hierarchy that you mentioned. It's interesting because, and it's only again 50% of of folks coming to, but from the wilderness side at least, I can kind of think about what that would look like. And if you're building that resiliency and self-efficacy and that confidence that a lot of kids get out of wilderness, the last thing you want is for them to come out and feel like, like I can't figure it out.
Yeah, that's
You
right.
need someone to
Right.
kind of tell you what to do, right? So
That's right.
that's huge.
It is. It can be a bit of a contradiction, right? To have this wilderness experience where, yeah, self confidence, self efficacy is all being built and fostered, and now I'm in some program where people are telling me how to live my life. Like
Yeah.
that's tough.
Right.
That's tough. I mean, the transition from wilderness in general is tough, like regardless of where a client goes. But I think even more so when they're kind of, when that sense of resilience and self-efficacy has been fostered, ignited, and then they get to a program where it's like, it's to put it in a sloppy way, maybe that's overly programmy, where where some of that kind of passion gets squashed.
Yeah. Totally.
So
Well, John, this has been really awesome. Like, for me personally, it's a huge honor. Like you've had a lot of years in this field and you've seen it all. I'm sure. And yeah, this has been a lot of fun. Is there anything else you want families to know, or any other folks coming out of wilderness to know? Anything else you would tell families or folks leaving wilderness or considering Red Cedar? Any last words?
um, I guess I'll say this: nothing specific to Red Cedar, but leaving wilderness, like I was talking about earlier, not every not every client, but I would say most, at least in my experience, are you know parents are seeing uh, changes and growth that they've never seen in their kids, and um, I would say that. Well, I mean, it makes sense that a lot of parents want to bring their kid back home or back to college after wilderness, because what they think they're seeing through letters and maybe even in-person visits and phone calls with the therapists are these tremendous changes. And I think those changes, at least in the context of wilderness, are real and are authentic. Like most of the time, I mean, some of the times they're kind of a put on, they're BS, but most of the time they're authentic. Like the client means what they're saying. But to put a client back in the environment, let's say, where they've lived the previous 18, 20 years, even after a 10 or 12 week wilderness program, and expect them not to engage in a lot of the old behavior, good luck.
Yeah.
Good luck. Like it's nearly impossible. And I'm not saying set everyone to Red Cedar. Like I said, we're not for everyone, but that's why I'm talking to parents now. That's why you're going to hear from professionals, and consultants, therapists, etc. Just the dangers of bringing them back home. It's for that reason. It's nearly impossible for them not to get back into some of the old unhealthy behaviors. And the counter argument is, well, John, they're going to have to learn how to live at home at some point. Absolutely, absolutely. And after 10 or 12 weeks, are they really ready for that? So, just something to kind of think about for parents with kids in wilderness now.
Yeah, no, I like that a lot. Yeah, I think a lot of folks just assume they're going to be like this new person after a
Yeah.
12-week experience, and they're going to get a lot of new skills and tools and learn a lot about themselves, do a lot of digging and work. But yeah, I don't know if that's realistic to be a whole new person, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah. I know we're wrapping up, so I'll make it quick, but I did a little bit of research. I mean, I've I've dove into this idea of transitions, and part of it from a very simplistic behavioral perspective is what's called environmental cues. And what that means is, like, a lot of the behaviors unhealthy behaviors that landed clients in wilderness therapy programs, they're learned behaviors, like for various reasons that this behavior was learned. And it was learned within a certain context, typically the context of home and school. So you put a person, and this actually goes for animals, like this is behavioral stuff. You put them back in the environment in which those behaviors were learned, and you expect them to do anything different. Like again, good luck. Like 10 or 12 weeks is nothing compared to 18 or 20 years of learning.
Yeah.
So part of it is just, it's on a very basic, like even non-human animal level, kind of stemming from learning theory and how we learn as organisms. So it's pretty interesting. And through that lens, we can really see, like, oh, I guess maybe it might be a little unrealistic to expect, Johnny to come back home and not, start doing drugs again, for example, or, fill in the blank. So, yeah.
John, Tobias, dropping knowledge. It was a lot of fun.
Likewise.
For families, folks listening, check out Red Cedar. Where can folks, how can people get a hold of you, or?
RedCedar.com.
Cool.
No. RedCedarTransitions.com.
Okay, perfect. We'll put that in the description so folks can find you. And John, thanks so much.
Yeah, my pleasure, Mark. Thank you.
Cheers.
All right, bye-bye.